What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're looking at one of Magnus Carlsen's best games from the first part of this Chessable Masters tournament. No, Magnus is not playing today, but that doesn't mean we can't look at some of his best games. And this one was versus the Asian Grandmaster Yu Yangyi. All right, in the game, Yu is playing as white. He opens 1e4, and Magnus in this game goes 1c5, the Sicilian defense. Now we have knight f3, knight to c6, one of his favorite moves here. And now, of course, the Rossolimo with the move bishop b5 on the board. Of course, white has two main ideas here. One is taking on c6, damaging black's pawn structure, and playing based on the weakened pawns on the queen side, and the other is castling very fast and going for a fast c3 and d4 advance. Now, how will Magnus counter this? He plays virtually every single move here, including Prognanda's new opening h5, but in this game, he does go g6, intending the fianchetto of the bishop on g7, and from there, playing it by ear. Now, again, white has two main ideas here. You can take on c6, and also you can castle, and in this game, he does take, and Magnus takes back with the d-pawn. Now, Magnus played this exact line many times in his one-on-one world championship match against Fabiano Caruana, I believe in the year 2018. Especially the first game of that match was absolutely insane. Check it out if you haven't seen it already. And Magnus really popularized this line where you take with a d-pawn, go bishop g7, and then try to somehow reroute the knight to a better square from g8. All right, here, white continues d3, going for a light squared strategy. You trade off the light squared bishop, then go d3, getting all your pawns in the center of the board on light squares. You want to intend bishop e3, queen d2, and so long. It's a very good strategy from white. Now black, how does he want to continue? In his world championship match, in game number 1, Magnus did go bishop g7, intending knight f6, then d7, then f8, then e6, then I think d4. But instead, in this game, he does go queen c7, gaining control of the e5 square and intending a very fast e5 break. Now white castles, black goes e5, and now white gains space on the queen side with the move a4. This move is very common in these sorts of pawn structures. White is threatening a5, gaining even more space. Therefore, black does go a5 himself, clamping down on the queen side. Now again, white here has a wide variety of ways to continue. You can go h3, gaining control of g4. You can go bishop e3, intending a fast queen d2, and so on. But instead, knight to a3 is the move. A very interesting choice. The point being, this knight is potentially heading to the c4 square, where it exerts a lot of pressure on the pawn on e5. And we see a relatively similar pawn structure in certain lines of the Berlin defense when white does trade on c6 after going d3. And overall, it's a good way to get the knight to c4 without hemming in the bishop on c1 with the move knight 1 to d2. Now here, black goes bishop g7, a very typical move. I do want to point out, the engine loves the idea of the Ben Feingold counterattack with the move f6, and Magnus does play this sort of pawn structure a lot, especially as white with colors reversed, where you basically go knight h6, knight f7, and so on, with a very compact structure on the king side. Instead, bishop g7 played in the game, white goes knight c4, again exerting more pressure on that pawn on e5, and black does go bishop e6, challenging the white knight on c4. With that in mind, here, white actually goes b3, bolstering the knight, and potentially setting up the idea of bishop b2 or bishop a3, exerting pressure on these weak dark squared pawns in the center and on the queen side. Now, Magnus, knight f6 is the move. A very provocative choice. Of course, you are blocking the bishop on g7 from defending the pawn on e5. However, of course, if white takes on e5 with, say, knight c takes e5, then black is always going to have the resource knight takes e4, opening up the discovered attack of the bishop on the knight on e5. That tactic is very well known from the king's Indian defense after 1d4, but it also works very well here. Now, instead, in this position, white just simply goes bishop b2, exerting again more and more pressure on that pawn on e5. And how is black going to defend? Well, he has the very simple move, again, very common in those Berlin defense structures, with the move knight d7. The point being, now the knight, the queen, and the bishop are all defending on e5. Therefore, white cannot take. However, here, Yu Yangyi, he finds a very creative way to again increase the pressure on black's position. He goes knight to g5, challenging the bishop on e6. And look at this. This bishop is now virtually locked in here. It's got pretty much nowhere it can go where you don't lose the piece. In fact, the only way to maintain your pawn structure and not get captured is pretty much to take on c4 immediately, and that is what Magnus does. So bishop takes c4, then we have b takes, recapturing towards the center, and now again the pawn structure becomes very, very interesting. Black giving up his bishop pair to damage white's pawn structure on the queen side. And yes, it is damaged. White with doubled c-pawns is going to have a much more difficult time achieving anything in the center. I mean, even if he does go c3, then d4, there isn't really a whole lot White can do from there, as if he ever takes on e5 or c5, his pawn structure would be even more damaged, potentially with triple pawns on the queen side. All right, now here, Magnus, he goes h6, driving back that knight. Now, there are two good squares for that knight to go to. You can go to f3 or h3, and in the game, Yu Yangyi, he actually goes knight h3. By far the more interesting choice. Of course, the benefit of going knight h3 is you don't block in the f-pawn, and that means the f-pawn advance, f2 to f4, is now a possibility. All right, Magnus Carlsen, the big question now, where do you want to move your king? Every other piece is developed besides your king and your two rooks on a8 and h8. Well, it turns out short castles is the safe option, but long castles is actually playable as well. You get your king to the queen side, intending a fast f5, and you can go for a vicious attack against the white king. Now, instead, short castles was played in the game, a perfectly fine choice, and now, of course, with the move knight h3 on the board, the most logical follow-up is going to be f4. That pawn on f4 would be sufficiently defended, and white would have a relatively large initiative on the king side. Now, instead, rook b1 was played in the game, and the benefit of this move, you do defend the bishop on b2 in advance. That way, if this diagonal opens up after, say, e takes f4, the bishop on b2 is defended, and beyond that, if the bishop moves, the rook is relatively active on the b file. However, overall, this plan is a little bit slow, and here Black even has the very interesting way to fight for the initiative on the queen side with the move b5. Now, instead of that, rook a to e8 was played in the game, a slightly weaker move by the goat, and now white does go bishop c3, opening up the b file for the rook and exerting some pressure on the pawn on a5. Now, Black goes b6, defending against both threats. The pawn on a5 and the pawn on b6 are both sufficiently defended, and now white goes rook b3, potentially intending queen b1 ideas, trying to increase pressure on the b file, and beyond that, of course, you are again guarding that bishop on c3 preemptively. That way there are no tactical ideas to try and exploit it on the long diagonal here with that bishop on g7. However, Magnus has a lot of experience in these pawn structures. After all, this was essentially his opening prep for the 2018 World Championship match against Fabiano Caruana. And here, Magnus just goes f5, gaining space on the king side and kickstarting his king side attack. Now, of course, if white takes on f5, e takes f5, then black just takes back with the g pawn, and it gets those two very strong pawns on e5 and f5. Technically, those are hanging pawns. You normally see those on the queen side after 1d4 openings, but I guess they're still hanging pawns in this scenario as well. Beyond that, if you do nothing, black may be able to go f4 in the spirit of the king's Indian defense, closing down the king side, intending a fast g5, g4, starting an attack again on that side of the board. Now, what is white going to do in the game? You does trade on f5. E takes f5 is the move. Black takes back, and then you swoops in with the queen, queen to f5, a very strong move. The queen is very active on this square, and of course, it does a lot to slow down black's attack on that side of the board. Now, Magnus, queen d6 is the move, guarding g6, a perfectly fine idea. The queen is certainly more active on the d6 square, and now white goes rook to e1, increasing the activity of his rook on the e file. Magnus, rook e7 is the move, defending along the 7th rank and setting up different ideas like rook f7 or rook f to e8 potentially. Now, white, rook b to b1, he retreats his rook, the rook not doing a whole lot on the b file. Of course, the knight on d7 always has b6 more than defended. Therefore, white goes rook b1, trying to get his rook back into the game. Now, Magnus, knight f6 is the move, putting pressure on the queen on h5. The queen has to go somewhere, but now, with the knight on f6, of course, you block the queen's defense of that g6 square, and now white simply goes queen g6, and now, look at this, the knight on f6 technically is pinned to the queen. If you go, say, knight d7, you actually lose the queen on the spot. That would be very, very tricky. With that in mind, Magnus, rook e6 is the move, defending the queen and also setting up all kinds of discovered attacks against the queen. And now the threat, if white wastes a move, let's say, I don't know, king to h1, then black's going to immediately go knight to e4 with the discovered attack on the queen, and the knight also targets the bishop. White would be losing material immediately. So you can't do that. Instead, queen g3 was played in the game, maintain the tension, and of course, white still has a relatively large advantage here. Those hanging pawns on f5 and e5, at least for right now, are more of a liability than an asset. All right, Magnus, knight h5 is the move, targeting the queen on g3. Not the best idea. White simply goes queen to h4, increasing the pressure on that knight on h4. What is black going to do? Here he goes for the move, e4, opening up the discovered attack of the bishop on g7 on the bishop on c3. Therefore, if white takes on h5, black takes on c3, attacks the rook, and black is doing just fine as white no longer has that dark squared bishop. Therefore, with that in mind here, white cannot do that. Instead, he takes on g7, bishop takes g7 is the move, and now the tactical justification. Black takes back with the knight, removing the attack on the knight from the queen, and black maintains the material balance. All right, now, Yu Yangyi, knight f4, jumping in with the knight, pressuring the rook on e6. Black goes rook to e5, and white goes queen to g3. So far in this game, Yu Yangyi maintaining tremendous pressure against black's position. What should Magnus be doing here to fight back? I'm not sure. For now, Magnus has to sit back and hold on and hope for a mistake by Yu Yangyi, because so far he is in complete control of this game. All right, here, Magnus, e takes d3 is the move. White takes back, then Magnus does trade one pair of rooks. Rook takes e1, then rook takes e1, and then king to f7 is the move, bringing the king into the game. A very interesting choice. The king now guards both g6 and e6, stopping all kinds of knight e6, knight g6, queen g6 ideas, and so on. All right, now queen f3 is the move for Yu Yangyi, increasing pressure on that pawn on c6 and therefore reducing the mobility of the queen on d6. All right, now we have rook to e8, offering the rook trade. White says, no way, Jose. Rook b1 is the move, targeting b6. Now black goes rook b8 defending, and white finally goes g3. A good multi-purpose move. First of all, reinforcing that knight on f4. Therefore, the queen is free to move, and also giving the king some space on g2 to advance to if it needs to later in the game. That there will be no back rank mating threats for a long time here. All right, black goes rook b7, getting his rook off the back rank. White goes rook to e1. He's sharking around. Then we have rook e7, rook b1, rook b7, and here Yu Yangyi, if he wants a draw, he can go for it immediately with the sequence rook e1, rook e7, rook b1, rook b7, and that would effectively be a draw on the spot via the threefold repetition rule. But instead, in this position, Yu Yangyi, queen to e2 is the move, gaining control of the e-file with the queen. Now, black goes rook e7, white goes queen to d1, retreating, black goes rook b7, and again, there's yet another draw offer with queen e2, rook e7, queen d1, rook to b7. But again, Yu Yangyi, he shows he is playing for a win. Queen to f3, Magnus goes queen to f6, and now here, the key move for white. You know what? This is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for white right here in this position to seize control of the game yet again. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. All right, here, the key idea for white is gonna be d4. What is the idea behind that move? It's very simple. You go d4. If black takes on d4 with the queen, queen takes d4, you take on c6 as the queen no longer guards that square if it goes to d4. Instead, if black takes on d4, then there is the insane looking move c5, the pawn sacrifice. That's not a pawn sacrifice, as if you take the pawn, you win the rook on b7, and if you go b5, that opens up the queen side to white's benefit. So overall, d4 right here is the key move, but Yu Yangyi, he misses it. Instead, knight d5 was played in the game. All right, what the heck is the idea here? It's very simple. If you take the knight, you take back with the queen, and then you have the double attack on the king on f7 and the rook on b7, you would win material. However, there's a very simple way to fight back. Black, the key move here is queen to d4, jumping in with the queen. Instead, in the game, queen d8 was was played, retreating and defending b6 with the queen, but this move is quite a bit more passive. Now, Yu Yangyi, of course, the knight on d5 is now being attacked. You have to move it. If you don't, black takes, and if you take back with the queen, hitting the king and the rook, black just takes with the queen, and you lose the knight, and you lose the game. Therefore, the knight must retreat. Where's it going to go? In the game, knight to e3 was chosen, but the computer does say knight c3 is quite a bit stronger. Instead, knight e3 chosen in the game, and now black punishes this slight inaccuracy. Of course, if you go knight c3, the pawn on d3 maintains is still defended by the queen on f3. Instead, after knight to e3, the knight blocks the defense of the d-pawn, and black swoops in. Queen takes d3, winning the pawn. White goes rook d1, trying to drive back that queen, and then we have queen to e4, offering the queen trade. And here, he does go for it. Queen takes, f takes, and now look at this. Black is officially up a pawn in the endgame. Yes, one of those pawns is doubled on the c-file, and yes, black does have more pawn islands than white. Therefore, overall, the endgame is roughly level, but that is to Magnus Carlsen's benefit. We all know how good this guy is in the endgame. All right, white, rook to d6 is the move, jumping in with the rook and pressuring c6. Now, black ignores the defense of the pawn. Black knows, Magnus knows, if you go, say, rook c7, trying to defend, your rook is now passive, white's is super active, he wins on h6, and white is effectively winning in the endgame. Therefore, instead, Magnus here, he ignores both pawns, and he simply goes b5, the key move, counterattacking on the queen side. Now, white takes, black takes, white takes again, and black takes again. Now, of course, the pawn on h6 is hanging. White takes it. But here, Magnus has those two very far advanced pawns on the queen side, and he will have plenty of chances in this endgame. All right, knight e6 is the move. Then we have knight to c4, blocking the pawn on the c-file. Now, black rook b4, pressuring the knight. We have knight takes a5, and then Magnus c4. He loses a pawn, but he doesn't care. His pawn on c4 is so far advanced that is the most important pawn on the board right now. All right, Yu Yangyi, rook h7 hits the king, king to f6, rook h6, king f7, rook h7, and again, white is offering a draw here. If black wants it, we have king f6, rook h6, rook h6, king f7, rook h7, and so on, and it is a draw on the spot. Instead, king g6 chosen in the game, and here, Yu Yangyi, he chokes on the spot. In the game, he plays the move rook to e7. Now, this looks very logical. You move the rook, attack the knight. I mean, what could be more logical than that? I guess chess is just a hard game because this move right here is a blunder and you lose on the spot. Instead, the key move to stay in the game and maintain roughly level chances is rook to h8, moving the rook back to the back rank. The point being, now the rook has access to c8 where it can guard the c-file. Instead, after rook to e7, you don't maintain access to c8. And here, after king to f6, you hit the rook, you defend the knight, and the rook cannot go to c8 where it guards the c-file and pressures the pawn on c4. Now white goes rook to e8, but it's too little, too late. Black goes c3, pushing the pawn. Now we have rook to c8, but now black knight to d4, jumping in with the knight. Magnus saw all of this. Now the problem, if you win the pawn on c3, black wins the rook with knight to e2, forking the king and the rook. This is the problem. The pawn is too far advanced. You're going to go c2, you're going to go rook b1, hitting the king, and then forcing in c1, promoting to a queen. Yu Yangyi with one inaccurate move, going rook to e7 instead of rook to e7 instead of rook to h8, losing access to the c-file for one more move, and now black is virtually winning here. Computer says 4.5 pawn relative advantage already. All right, Yu Yangyi, king to g2, getting the king off the back rank, getting rid of those rook b1 with check ideas from black. But Magnus, rook c2 is the move anyway, pushing the pawn down the board. Now rook to c3. Then we have e3. Magnus blowing open the king side. White takes on e3, and then we have rook to b2. This is the idea. You give up the pawn, forcing f takes e3, and now the threat is c1, promoting to a queen, and the rook hits the king with check. To fight back, white goes king to f1, retreating his king. Now, of course, if you go c1, you lose that precious pawn. So instead, knight to e2 was chosen. Again, the idea, if you take the knight, c1 promotes, and again, black is winning. So you can't take the knight. But if you don't take the knight, black's going to go c1, promote to a queen, white takes, black takes back, and black is going to be up a rook in the endgame. All right, rook c6 is the move, hitting the king. We have king to f5, knight to b3. The knight jumps back, trying to defend, but now Magnus, king to e4. The king is now a fighting piece in the endgame. Here, according to the engine, the only move to have any sort of chance to hang on, and it's not much, is the move g4, but instead we have knight d2 chosen in the game. This is a colossal mistake. Black goes king d3. Again, the king march continues. Then we have rook d6, king takes e3, knight c4, king to e4, and now knight to d2 is the move, hitting the king once again. And I do want to point out here, the rook on b2, it is hanging, but you cannot take it. If you take it, c1 promotes to a queen, wins the knight, and wins the game. All these tactics are crazy in this endgame. So instead, knight d2 was chosen. Then we have king to f5. The king retreats. Then rook c6. Then finally, c1 promotes to a queen. We have rook takes, then knight takes, and now in the endgame here, black is up an entire rook against the 2 extra pawns for white. Magnus here most likely is going to clean up. Let's keep going and see how it ends. We have knight c4, rook takes h2, knight e3 hits the king, king to e5, king g1 hits the rook, rook to a2, knight g4 hits the king e4, knight f6, king f3, knight d5, and now look at this. Magnus Carlsen, he somehow achieved a mating attack against the white king. Knight e2, and now here, yes, you can go king to h1, but that is met by knight to g3 check, hitting the king, and then we still have a mate. Instead, here, Yu Yangyi being a good sport, king to f1, allowing a faster checkmate. And now, of course, Magnus, he plays the back rank mate, rook to a1, winning the game on the spot. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Yu Yangyi. I mean, Magnus going into, a very tricky opening as black. I mean, right out of the opening, white had a very large advantage. Even by, say, move 10 here, white was significantly better. These structures, these like Berlin defense exchange structures, I'll show it in a minute, where black has this bishop on g7. They're very, very tough for black. But Magnus going for it anyway and doing great. And by the way, the Berlin opening I was talking about is e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, knight f6, d3, bishop c5, then takes. In this structure, black really doesn't want to have his bishop on g7. If he has it there, black's chances are a little bit worse. So Magnus going for kind of a dubious version of this Berlin exchange variation, but still somehow managing to make it work and slowly outplay Yu Yangyi throughout this game. Very impressive stuff. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, comment down below in terms of what you thought of this game. Smash that like button if you can. It really does help me out a ton. I'm trying to make as many videos as I can for you guys. So, show me some love, smash that like button. And if you want to see more Magnus Carlsen action from this tournament, check out this game right here where Magnus played yet another crazy game from this Chessable Masters tournament. And I'll see you in the next video.